The dream had always been the same, but it was never quite the same. Each time it unfolded, it felt more unsettling, more urgent. A place, a scene, a moment, something wasn't right. They had both seen it. For months now it had consumed their nights. But it wasn't just one person. Two strangers, miles apart, had somehow shared the same haunting vision, the kind of dream that shouldn't belong to anyone. It was impossible, yet it was undeniable. Clara had always been a skeptic, a woman of science, of logic, of concrete explanations. Her life was predictable, safe. She had built her world on structure and routine, working in the quiet comfort of a university library. Day in, day out, she sorted through papers, sorted through lives, detached, focused, certain of her place in the world. She didn't believe in fate nor destiny. She had little time for things she couldn't explain, like dreams. But this was different. The first time it happened, she woke up in a cold sweat, unsure if she'd been dreaming or if it had been something more. The vision had been so real, so vivid, that for a moment, Clara felt a nagging certainty that it had to mean something. The sound of a door creaking, the dark hallway that stretched infinitely, the feeling of being followed, these were the things that stayed with her. When she began to realise that she wasn't the only one having this dream, Clara was alarmed. That night she'd shared a conversation about her experience with a stranger, a man she'd met briefly through an online forum for sleep disorders. His name was Mark, and when she told him about the dream, his voice cracked on the other end of the phone. He had seen it too, in every detail. The door, the hallway, the eerie feeling of being pursued, everything. Mark was nothing like Clara. He was an artist, a drifter, living in a small apartment above a coffee shop. His life was unplanned, often chaotic. He found solace in late nights spent with paints and brushes, letting his hands express what his words couldn't. Yet, despite the differences in their lives, this shared dream began to draw them together in an inexplicable way. They both felt as though they were caught in the same thread, a line that linked them in ways neither could understand. Neither of them knew why or how it had happened, but they both knew one thing for certain. They were not imagining it. This dream was real, and it was pulling them deeper, each night more intense than the last. The city was quiet when Clara walked home that evening, a soft chill creeping through the streets, the wind carrying whispers of a coming storm. The time was late, far too late for someone like her to be out. But lately, sleep had become a stranger. The dream had taken root, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it, it lingered. It twisted her thoughts and made the shadows around her seem more alive. She hurried her steps as if by walking faster she could outrun whatever was chasing her inside her own mind. She hadn't yet told Mark the latest detail, the shadow that now followed her in the dream. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It had form. Dark and long, it just beyond the edges of sight, only barely noticed, but always there. The more they shared, the more real it became. It was as if the dream was evolving, and they, Clara and Mark, were the ones feeding it. Was it a warning? A premonition? Or was it simply the work of an overactive imagination? But no matter how she rationalised it, the nagging feeling of dread never went away. The dream was becoming a nightmare. That night, she messaged Mark, her fingers hovering over the keys. "It's getting worse," she typed. "I think it's starting to follow me." She sat back, looking at the screen. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his reply. She had almost convinced herself to turn off the phone, go to bed, and pretend that everything was fine. But then the message came. I saw it too. Mark's reply was short, the words simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't been expecting. It's here, in the real world now, not just in the dream. Clara's pulse raced. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, a chill deeper than the air outside. She was not alone in this. She hadn't imagined it. The apartment she lived in was small, only a single bedroom with an old wooden floor and a threadbare rug. She had never been one to spend much time there. The world outside her window was her focus. But tonight, there was no escaping it. She turned off the lamp beside her bed and closed her eyes, desperate for sleep, but the darkness seemed to press against her. The feeling of being watched, the feeling of something waiting, was almost suffocating. The dream returned. She felt it before she even opened her eyes. The hallway, endless and dark, stretched before her. The door, creaking open. The presence she couldn't shake. It wasn't just a dream. It was becoming more. It was a warning. She had to escape. As the minutes stretched into hours, Clara's mind swirled. There were no answers, only shadows, a suffocating silence. The more she tried to resist, the more the dream pulled her in, dragged her deeper. It wasn't just a dream. It was a thread that tied her to someone else, someone she hadn't even met, yet whose presence in her life was undeniable. In a small apartment above a coffee shop, Mark sat in his own quiet room. He had never been one to talk about his feelings, much less his dreams. But there was something about this shared nightmare that unsettled him in a way that he couldn't explain. Was it just a dream? Was it coincidence that both of them had started dreaming the same thing? Or was there something far more sinister at play? He had no answers. He only knew that every night when he closed his eyes, he would find himself in the same dark place. The dream, the door, the hallway, and the shadow. Each night got darker. The tension between Clara and Mark was thick. The shared dream pulled them together, but neither could explain why. Neither could understand how they were connected, and worse still, neither could escape. Clara sat at her desk, fingers trembling as she stared at her phone. The dim light of her apartment cast long shadows against the walls, but it was the darkness in her mind that kept her paralyzed. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was changing. Something that had begun in the dream and was now seeping into her waking life. Her eyes darted to the clock. It was past midnight. She should have been asleep hours ago, but the phone's glow kept her wide awake, her thumb hovering above Mark's name in the messages. She had been lying to herself for weeks, telling herself it was just a dream. But the more she tried to resist it, the stronger it became. Tonight was different. The dream had changed. It was no longer just a shadow lingering in the edges of her perception. Now it was moving closer, watching her. A presence she couldn't ignore. Mark's message echoed in her mind. It's here in the real now, not just in the dream. He was right. It was here. The dream had crossed the line between sleep and reality. Clara's phone buzzed again, dragging her back to the present. She picked it up, her heart pounding. Another message from Mark. She opened it without hesitation. I saw it. The shadow. It was in my room tonight. I swear, Clara, it was standing at the edge of my bed, watching me. She stared at the words, her breath caught in her throat. The nightmare had followed them both. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. Suddenly, the silence of her apartment felt too suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her, as if the very air had thickened with something unseen. She shivered and stood up, pacing the room. The shadows on the walls twisted, stretching in unnatural shapes. She glanced at the door, the window. Everything was exactly as it should be. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then it happened, a sound faint at first but distinct, a soft creak of wood. Clara froze, her breath hitched in her chest. She listened, straining to hear it again. There it was, closer this time. The floorboard in the hallway outside her apartment had just shifted. It was impossible. No one was supposed to be here. She lived alone. The creaking continued, slow, deliberate, as if someone were walking toward her door. Her heart raced. The air around her felt thick, stifling. She glanced back at her phone, seeing Mark's last message again. It was standing at the edge of my bed. Her fingers were shaking now, but she managed to type a quick reply. Mark, please, tell me you're not alone. But before she could send it, a loud bang echoed through her apartment, the sound of something heavy crashing against the wall outside her door. Clara jumped back, her breath catching in her throat. The creaking had stopped. She could hear nothing now but the pounding of her own heart. She moved cautiously toward the door, her hand trembling as it reached for the knob. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She had to know. She had to face whatever this was. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, and she hesitated, her mind racing. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? Something darker? Something more dangerous? What if the dream had followed her here into the real world? Taking a deep breath, Clara twisted the knob and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. Her gaze darted back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The faint smell of dust hung in the air, and the light above flickered once before settling into a steady hum. Clara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her as she stepped into the hallway, her mind trying to make sense of what was happening. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she tiptoed toward the stairs, every step echoing loudly in the stillness. The building was old, the kind of place that creaked and groaned at night, but Clara had lived here for years and had never heard sounds like this before. There was something unnatural about it, something intentional. She was certain now that it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. As she reached the top of the staircase, she noticed something strange. The door at the end of the hall, the door that led to the abandoned apartment next door, was slightly ajar. It had never been opened before. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know why, but her feet moved toward it, drawn by an invisible force. Each step felt like it took her closer to the heart of the mystery, closer to whatever it was that had been haunting her for weeks. She stopped in front of the door, her breath shallow, and peeked through the crack. The apartment inside was dark, but there was a faint light flickering at the far end. A shadow moved past the light. Clara's stomach twisted. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Someone was in there. She reached for her phone again, but before she could dial Mark's number, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Clara?" She whipped around, but no one was there. The voice had been faint, distant, but it had come from somewhere behind her. Someone had said her name. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop suddenly. Clara's breath came out in a visible cloud. She turned back to the door, her hand now shaking as it reached for the handle. There was no time to waste. She had to find out what was happening, and she had to do it now. As she pushed the door open, the smell of something stale and decayed hit her like a physical force. The room inside was dark, but the flickering light she had seen earlier was now a glowing red, casting a sickly hue over everything. The walls were covered in what looked like markings, scribbles, scratches, jagged lines that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Clara stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty, save for a single chair at the far end, but as she approached it, she saw something she hadn't expected, a figure sitting in the chair facing away from her. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure didn't move. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her heart hammering louder now. And then the figure turned. It wasn't Mark. It was her. Clara's own face stared back at her from the chair, pale and twisted in a grotesque imitation of her own expression. The shadow in the dream had crossed over completely. "Clara," the figure whispered, and its lips twisted into a smile that was not her own. Clara stumbled back, her pulse racing, as her own twisted reflection sat in the chair, grinning at her. The air in the room felt thick, as if the very walls were closing in, pressing against her chest. Her mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. The darkness, the shadows, the echo of her own voice, all of it swirled around her in a nightmare she couldn't escape. "Clara?" The figure repeated her name, its smile widening in an unnatural, mocking way. "Don't you remember?" Clara's heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The room seemed to warp around her, the red light flickering violently, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. It was as if the nightmare had taken control of the world, and she was merely a puppet in its grip. "Get away from me!" Clara finally managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it leaned forward, its face coming too close, the twisted version of her own features still locked in that haunting grin. "You're not alone, Clara. You never were." Clara's breath hitched. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, desperately searching for an escape, but the door was gone. The room was closing in on her. The walls were pressing against her, forcing her closer to the figure. It felt suffocating. Then she heard a sound, soft at first, almost inaudible, like a distant murmur in the back of her mind. It was Mark's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Clara?" Her heart skipped a beat. She knew she had to find him. She had to get to him, whatever this thing was, whatever this nightmare had become. The figure in front of her seemed to blur for a moment, its mocking expression fading. The air shifted and the oppressive weight on her chest lifted just enough to make her breathe again. "Mark!" Clara cried out, but her voice felt weak. The words were drowned out by the cacophony of noise in her mind. Suddenly the figure dissolved into a shadow and swept toward her with unnatural speed. Clara gasped, stumbling back. The room seemed to twist around her as the walls contorted, stretching and shifting like a living thing. She barely had time to react before the shadow lunged, cold fingers brushing against her arm. "No!" Clara screamed, her body jerking instinctively away from the touch. But the shadow wouldn't let go. It wrapped around her, seeping into her skin, into her very bones, dragging her into the darkness. A blinding flash of light erupted, and Clara was thrown backward, crashing into the floor. For a moment she was disoriented, unable to breathe as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Then she realized she was no longer in the room. She was back in her apartment. The cold, sterile walls surrounded her once more. But the nightmare wasn't over. Clara staggered to her feet, her hands trembling. Her eyes darted to the window. Outside, the city was eerily still, bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. She could hear nothing, no sounds of traffic, no distant chatter. The silence felt suffocating, unnatural. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Clara's stomach dropped. It was Mark. "Clara, I saw it again. It's following me. I don't know how much longer I can stay awake." The message was short, but the panic in it was clear. She quickly typed a reply, her fingers shaking as she hit send. "We need to meet. We need to figure out what's happening. Where are you?" But there was no answer. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Clara's gut twisted with unease. Something wasn't right. The phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message. It was a call. Mark's name flashed on the screen. Clara didn't hesitate. She answered the call, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark? Mark, are you there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence on the other end was deafening. "Mark?" Clara called again, more urgently this time, her heart racing. And then a voice. Faint, as if coming from far away, but unmistakable. "Clara, they're coming for us." The line went dead. Clara's blood ran cold. She clutched the phone, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what to do. Was this all a delusion? Had she crossed some line between dream and reality? She could still hear Mark's voice in her head, see his haunted expression as he'd told her about the shadow following him. The connection between them felt deeper now, stronger than it had been before. She couldn't just ignore it. She had to find him. And yet, as she stood there staring at her phone in disbelief, the realization hit her. She couldn't do it alone. She needed someone to help her. With one last glance around her apartment, Clara grabbed her coat and bolted out the door, determined to find Mark. As she stepped into the night, the world seemed eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. The streets were empty, the wind whispering through the trees. It felt as though everything was waiting for something, waiting for her to move. The city felt different tonight. The shadows seemed deeper, darker. The buildings loomed over her, casting long, twisted silhouettes against the pale moonlight. Clara quickened her pace, her breath forming visible clouds in the air as she walked faster. She had to find Mark. She had to understand what was happening. But the streets seemed endless. As she walked, she felt the nagging sensation that she was being followed. Every turn, every shadow seemed to conceal something, someone, something she couldn't see but could feel closing in on her. Then a noise. A soft, almost imperceptible sound caught her attention. It was coming from an alleyway to her right. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound. There, at the far end of the alley, she saw him. "Mark. Mark," she called, rushing toward him, but the closer she got, the more distant he seemed. It was as if the ground itself was shifting beneath her feet. "Clara?" Mark's voice echoed, but it wasn't coming from his mouth. It was coming from the shadows. "You shouldn't." Clara froze. The figure in the alley wasn't Mark. It was a twisted version of him, his features distorted by shadows, his eyes hollow and dark. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What's happening?" The figure smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was the same mocking, twisted grin that had haunted her in the dream. "You're not ready, Clara," it whispered. And then, before she could react, the shadows closed in, pulling her into the darkness once more. The darkness swallowed Clara whole, her hitching as the shadows tightened around her. She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. She was trapped in an endless black void, her thoughts spinning as her heart raced in panic. She had been pulled into this nightmare once more, and this time it felt like there was no escape. The twisted version of Mark smiled at her from the shadows, its eyes hollow and knowing. "You're not ready, Clara," it whispered, its voice echoing in the silence. Clara's mind screamed. She had to escape. But where? The alley? The city? The apartment? Everything had been consumed by the same suffocating darkness. There was no reality anymore. It was as if she had slipped between two worlds, one that was real and one that was not. And in this shadowed realm, she was no longer sure which was which. "You're part of it now," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "It's already too late. You've crossed the line." "No," Clara gasped, shaking her head, her voice raw with desperation. She couldn't believe it. She wouldn't believe it. She wasn't just going to give in to this nightmare. She was stronger than that. With a surge of resolve, Clara forced herself to take a step back. She couldn't let this thing control her. This wasn't her reality. This wasn't real. She clenched her fists, pushing past the suffocating darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. Her body trembled, but she refused to let fear win. She had to fight. She had to wake up. "Mark!" she shouted into the abyss, her voice breaking. "Mark, where are you?" For a moment there was only silence. Then a voice, weak, almost too faint to hear, whispered through the void. "Clara, you can't escape. We are one now." Clara's pulse quickened. The voice was still Mark's, but it wasn't. She could feel the truth in the words, cold and cruel. The nightmare had consumed him too. He was no longer the person she had known. "You're not Mark," Clara yelled, defiant. "You're not him. You're just a shadow, a part of this nightmare." The figure grinned wider, its face twisting into something even darker. "It's not just a dream, Clara. It's you." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the shadows seemed to come alive. The walls closed in around her as the darkness reached out with tendrils, curling and twisting toward her body. Clara stumbled backward, panic rising in her chest, but she couldn't stop. The nightmare was moving, alive, suffocating her with its weight. But then she remembered. The dreams, the shadows, the thing that had followed her, that had followed Mark. She knew what this was. She had to face it head on. Without thinking, Clara reached deep inside herself, focusing on the one thing she could control. Her will to fight, her desire to wake up. She had to make a choice. A real choice. "I am the one who controls this!" she shouted, her voice rising with power. "I am not your prisoner." The darkness recoiled, the shadows swirling violently around her as if reacting to her words. For a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of something familiar, something real, in the black void. It was faint, like a light at the end of a tunnel, but it was enough to make her push forward. She held her breath, her hands shaking as she reached out into the darkness. Her fingers brushed something solid, something warm, a presence, a shape. It was Mark. He was here, somewhere. She could feel him. "Mark!" she cried, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Mark, I'm here!" For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a shift. The nightmare seemed to pull back, the walls of the shadowy world wavering as if uncertain of how to react. Clara could feel the weight on her chest ease, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt like she could breathe again. "Clara?" Mark's voice was faint, like a whisper on the wind. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Mark, it's me!" Clara shouted, the desperation in her voice giving way to hope. She could feel him, just beyond her reach. She could feel him waking up. He was still there. He wasn't lost. With every ounce of strength she had, Clara forced herself forward. She reached deeper into the abyss, and her fingers made contact with something warm. Something that was no longer a shadow, but flesh. She grabbed hold of Mark's arm, pulling him closer, her heart racing. But the moment she made contact, the nightmare screamed in agony. The shadows writhed and twisted, trying to separate them, trying to tear them apart. "No!" Clara gasped, clutching Mark's arm with all her strength. "We're not letting go. You're not taking him." The shadows thrashed violently at a surge of darkness threatening to rip them apart. The air around Clara felt electric, crackling with energy. She could feel herself slipping, her body and mind teetering on the edge of the abyss. But she couldn't let go. She wouldn't. She couldn't. And then, in that moment of chaos, Clara made the final, fateful decision. she let go of the fear. With everything she had left, she closed her eyes and whispered the words she knew would either break the nightmare or end her forever. Shah, I choose reality. The world exploded. The shadows shattered into pieces, disintegrating into the nothingness from which they had come. The air grew still. The ground beneath her feet solidified, and Clara's breath came in sharp, frantic gasps. The nightmare, the shadow, vanished like it had never been there at all. And then Clara opened her eyes. She was in her apartment. The walls, the furniture, everything was exactly as it should be. She could hear the distant hum of the city, the faint sound of life outside. And more importantly, she felt Mark beside her. He was there, his hand gripping hers tightly, his face pale but real and alive. "Clara?" Mark whispered, his voice rough. "What did we just do?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked around, her breath slow and steady now. She could feel the weight of the experience pressing on her chest, but there was no shadow, no twisted nightmare. They had done it. They had won. "Whatever it was," Clara whispered, her voice full of resolve, "we're free." And as she held Mark's hand, she realized something profound. No shadow, no nightmare, no darkness could ever take that away. They had chosen reality. They had chosen life. The world around Clara felt heavier than it ever had before, though the nightmare had shattered, and the shadows had been vanquished. The remnants of the dark, oppressive force that had ruled her mind seemed to linger just beyond her reach. As Clara sat on the edge of the bed, Mark's hand still in hers, the steady pulse of the city outside her apartment was both comforting and alien. She had been here before, yet now it felt unfamiliar, foreign, as if she had crossed a threshold she could never uncross. Mark's eyes were wide with confusion, searching hers for some kind of explanation. His face, pale and drawn, was lined with exhaustion, his hair sticking to his forehead. She knew that he, too, felt the weight of the battle they had just endured. "Clara," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. Are we really awake? Is this real?" Clara squeezed his hand tighter, trying to reassure herself more than him. She nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure of anything anymore. The line between dream and reality had been so thin, so blurry, that the idea of returning to a normal life felt almost impossible. "It's real," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We're here. We're safe." But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew they weren't entirely true. They had escaped the nightmare, yes, but what did it mean to truly be free from something that had followed them, night after night, into their very thoughts? Mark leaned back against the headboard, his face twisting with a mix of exhaustion and fear. He didn't say anything at first, but Clara could see it in his eyes. The same fear she felt. The same lingering uncertainty. Was it truly over, or had they merely survived a phase of a more insidious struggle yet to come? "What happened to us, Clara?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of everything they'd endured. Clara let out a shaky breath. She felt the tremor in her chest as the memories of the darkness returned, vivid and suffocating. "I don't know, but it's over now. We've made it through." Mark's hand gripped hers tighter, as if grounding himself to the present. But why? Why did it happen in the first place? Why were we chosen for this? Clara's mind raced. She had no answers. They had both been chosen, pulled into that abyss without explanation, haunted by the same twisted visions. But there was one thing she knew with certainty now. The nightmare was a reflection of something deeper. It was a battle for control, a fight to hold on to who they were, to their sense of self, in a world that constantly threatened to consume them. "We were connected," Clara said softly, "in the dream, in the darkness. I don't know why, but we were linked, and whatever it was, it needed to break us, to keep us trapped there. But we fought back, Mark. We fought, and we didn't give up." Mark nodded slowly, though his gaze was far away. Clara could see that his mind was still tangled in the webs of their shared experience. He wasn't ready to let go of the questions, and Clara knew she wasn't either. But she could see, in the way he held her hand, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, that he, too, was starting to let the weight of the nightmare fall away. Slowly, like the sun pushing through storm clouds, they were finding their way back to something real. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but filled with the space they both needed to process what had just happened. The events of the past weeks, weeks or days, Clara couldn't tell, had reshaped them. There was no going back to who they had been before. They had both changed. After a while, Mark turned to her, his expression softening, though a flicker of concern remained. "What happens now, Clara? Do we just move on?" Clara thought about that for a moment. Could they just move on? Could she return to the life she once knew and pretend like nothing had happened? The idea felt hollow, as if something had shifted inside her that couldn't be unshaken. But she also knew that they had both survived something extraordinary. They had made it through a darkness that no one else could understand, and in doing so they had found strength in each other they hadn't known was possible. "I think we have to try," Clara said, her voice gaining steadiness. "We can't live in the shadow of what happened. We have to go on. Together." Mark's eyes softened as he reached for her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Together," he echoed, his voice filled with a quiet promise. And just like that, Clara felt the weight of the past begin to shift. It didn't disappear entirely, but the tension that had gripped her chest began to loosen. They had been through something impossible, something that had tested them to their very core. But now, as the morning light began to filter through the curtains, they had made it through. They had survived. For a while, they simply sat there, both lost in their own thoughts but united in the silence. The world outside seemed to continue as it always had, indifferent to the battle they had just faced. The city buzzed with life, people walking down the streets, unaware of the nightmare that had just been defeated. Eventually, Clara stood up, moving to the window and looking out at the city below. It seemed so distant now, so small. The nightmares, the darkness, it all seemed so far removed from the calm, peaceful world she saw now. Mark joined her by the window, standing a little behind her, his presence a steady comfort. Together, they looked out at the world, at the life that awaited them beyond the confines of the nightmare. "We've earned a second chance," Clara said quietly, the weight of the words settling in her chest. Mark smiled, his hand finding hers again. "Yeah, we have!" And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was truly over. The shadows, the fear, the uncertainty, they were behind them. They had made it out, and now it was time to move forward, together. The days following the battle against the darkness seemed to pass in a blur, each one gradually lifting Clara and Mark from the weight of their shared nightmare. There was no clear demarcation of when the suffering had truly ended, but slowly, imperceptibly, they both began to feel the relief settle in. The sharp edges of their fears softened, like sand smoothing against the pull of an endless tide. Clara woke each morning to the sound of distant city traffic, to the sunlight that streamed through the apartment window. It felt real, like the calm before a storm, and yet the storm was something Clara now knew she could withstand. She had been to the edge, been to the dark corners of her own mind, and had returned with Mark, the only person who had fought by her side. Together they had survived, and together they were now free. But as the days wore on, Clara's mind began to settle into a rhythm, one she hadn't known in a long time. She found herself asking questions she had never allowed herself to ask before. The dream that had once haunted her. Why had it happened? Was it a warning? A lesson? Was there a purpose to the darkness that had consumed her? The answer still felt elusive, a shadow that never quite revealed itself. But one thing Clara knew for sure. She had changed, irrevocably. It wasn't just the nightmare that had altered her. It was the strength she had discovered in herself. The courage that had carried her through the darkest moments had not come from external forces or from anyone else. It had come from deep within, from a place she hadn't realized existed until she needed it most. Mark, too, had changed. He no longer carried the same confusion in his eyes, the same uncertainty that had once clouded his every thought. He had faced the nightmare too and had fought for their survival. In that battle, they had discovered something profound about each other, about the bond they shared and the importance of not facing darkness alone. One evening, as Clara sat by the window, gazing out at the city below, she felt a shift within herself. The world was still spinning, still turning. The city pulsed with life, its lights twinkling like stars in the night sky. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to escape. The world was not a place to flee from. It was a place to engage with, to live in, to create something new from. And Clara was ready. Mark stood in the doorway, watching her silently, his hands in his pockets. His expression was calm, but there was something more in his gaze, a quiet understanding, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" She turned to look at him, meeting his gaze with a soft smile. "All the time," she said. "But I think we've already made the biggest step. The rest, it's just living." Mark took a step toward her, his hand reaching out to rest on her shoulder. "Together?" Clara's smile widened. "Together." There were no grand gestures, no promises of an epic future. There didn't need to be. They had faced the darkest fears together, had come out on the other side stronger, more certain of who they were and what they wanted. The future was uncertain, yes, but Clara felt ready to face it with Mark by her side. "I think," Clara said, her voice soft but resolute, "we've both learned that we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to keep moving forward, one step at a time." Mark nodded, his hand still resting gently on her shoulder. "And we will," he said. "We'll keep moving forward." The next few days felt like a kind of exhale, a relief after years of holding their breath. They rebuilt their lives piece by piece together. Mark returned to his work, his job a constant reminder of the ordinary world that existed outside of the nightmare they had escaped. Clara, too, began to find her footing again, stepping into her own rhythm, reclaiming the small, quiet moments that once seemed so insignificant. But even in the calm, Clara couldn't help but feel that the world had shifted. The darkness had been vanquished, yes, but it had left its mark. It had taught her the importance of resilience, of finding strength even in the most impossible circumstances. It had shown her that the bonds they formed with others were the only true lifelines in the end. And most of all, it had taught her that sometimes the most difficult journeys led to the most profound discoveries, not just about the world, but about oneself. It wasn't a dramatic, sweeping transformation. There was no sudden flash of insight, no moment of absolute clarity. But as the weeks passed and life returned to its usual rhythm, Clara began to notice small changes within herself. She was more patient, more present. She laughed more freely, her joy no longer weighed down by the spectre of past fears. One afternoon, Mark and Clara sat at a cafe in the heart of the city, the sounds of life surrounding them. They sipped their coffee in silence, comfortable in the shared space, no words needed. But Clara could feel the connection between them, a quiet understanding, a shared strength that didn't need to be spoken. "Do you think the nightmares will ever come back?" Mark asked, his voice thoughtful. Clara looked out the window at the bustling street, the world continuing as it always had. It seemed impossible that such darkness had ever existed in this space, but she knew the truth. She had faced it, had fought it, and had emerged stronger. No, the nightmares wouldn't return. Not in the same way, not in the same form. And even if they did, Clara now knew that she had the strength to face whatever came. "Maybe," Clara said slowly, "but if they do, we'll face them. Together." Mark smiled, his eyes warm with something deeper than gratitude. It was understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared journey. And in that moment, Clara knew that the nightmare had not only ended, but it had forged something lasting between them. A bond, a lesson, a realization. No matter what darkness might come in the future, they would face it together. That was the most powerful thing they had gained, something that could never be taken from them. They were no longer defined by the nightmare. They had made it through, and now they were ready for whatever life had in store. Together.